The tin box never left her lap during 3 days of riding. Claire's fingers traced its edges like a rosary, while Red guided them through a patchy country, past burned homesteads and bleached bones. She spoke only when necessary: water, rest, direction. But when they crested Cemetery Ridge and saw the weathered crosses below, she finally whispered the words that had traveled 800 miles in silence. Red had buried outlaws, soldiers, and children. He thought he knew grief, until she opened that saddlebag and showed him what love looks like when it refuses to let go. The morning Claire hired Red McKenna, she carried herself like a woman made of glass, fragile but sharp enough to cut anyone who handled her carelessly. She stood in the dusty street outside Brennan's saloon, clutching a leather satchel against her chest, her black dress already gathering the fine Utah dust that settled on everything like ash. Her eyes held the particular emptiness that comes after crying for weeks, when tears become a luxury the body can no longer afford. Red had seen that look before, in mirrors mostly, but never worn so completely by someone still breathing. She didn't negotiate his price or question his reputation. When he named his fee for the 3-day ride to the abandoned fort, she simply reached into her satchel and counted out the coins with steady fingers. Her wedding ring caught the morning light, a thin band of gold that seemed too heavy for her delicate hand. Red noticed she wore it on her right hand now, moved from its proper place like everything else in her life had been displaced by whatever brought her to this god-forsaken corner of the territory. The saddlebag she insisted on carrying herself weighed more than it should have for its size. Red offered to secure it with the rest of her belongings, but she shook her head with such finality that he didn't ask again. She mounted her horse, a gentle mare that seemed to understand its rider's fragility, and settled the bag across her lap like a mother cradling a sleeping child. The way she held it, protective and tender, made Red's chest tighten with recognition of something sacred being transported. They rode out of town as the sun climbed over the red rocks, casting long shadows that would shorten and disappear before stretching out again toward evening. Claire kept her eyes fixed on the horizon, as if she could see their destination already, as if she'd been traveling toward it her entire life. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of quiet that forms around grief, respectful and necessary. Red had learned long ago that some passengers carried burdens too heavy for conversation. The first day passed without incident, though Red kept his rifle close and his eyes moving across the landscape. This was country where Apache raiders still moved like ghosts, where outlaws holed up in box canyons, where a man could disappear between one ridge and the next. But Claire seemed untouched by fear, riding with the calm determination of someone who had already faced the worst thing that could happen to her. Her composure was more unsettling than tears would have been. As they made camp that first evening, Red watched her carefully place the saddlebag beside her bedroll, her hand resting on it even as she slept. In the firelight, her face looked carved from marble, beautiful and cold and eternal. He wondered what kind of love could drive a woman to cross outlaw country alone, what promise could be worth risking Apache arrows and bandit bullets. But he didn't ask, because some questions were too sacred for strangers to voice. The second morning brought clouds that promised rain, but delivered only the threat of it, hanging low and grey like a shroud over the mesa country. Claire woke before dawn, her hand already reaching for the saddlebag before her eyes fully opened, a gesture so automatic it seemed carved into her bones by repetition. Red watched her through half-closed eyes as she sat up and checked the bag's contents, not opening it, just testing its weight, feeling for the shape of whatever lay inside. Her movements held the reverence of a priest handling communion wine. They broke camp in the pre-dawn darkness, riding by starlight until the sun painted the eastern sky the color of old blood. The landscape grew more desolate with each mile. Scattered juniper trees, twisted by wind into shapes that looked like prayers, frozen in wood. Arroyos carved deep by flash floods that came once a decade to reshape the earth. This was country that broke men's spirits before it broke their bodies, where the silence was so complete it seemed to have weight and substance. Red tried twice to make conversation, asking about her journey's origin, commenting on the weather, but Claire's responses came in single words or gentle nods that discouraged further attempts. She wasn't being rude. Her silence felt more like a form of mourning, as if speaking too much might somehow dishonor whatever she carried. The saddlebag never left her lap, never shifted position, held with the steady devotion of a vigil candle that must never be allowed to go out. By midday, they encountered their first real danger, dust clouds on the southern horizon that could mean Apache war party or outlaw band, either one capable of ending their journey in blood and screaming. Red reined in his horse and studied the distant riders through his spyglass, counting at least 6 mounted men moving with the purposeful speed of hunters following a trail. He turned to warn Claire, to suggest they find cover in the rocks ahead, but found her watching him with eyes that held no fear, only a quiet acceptance that seemed to encompass every possible outcome. "We keep riding," she said, her first complete sentence in hours. "Whatever happens, we keep riding toward the fort." Her voice carried the weight of absolute conviction, as if she'd already calculated the cost of every choice and found them all acceptable compared to failing in her mission. Red nodded and spurred his horse forward, understanding that he was no longer just a guide, but a guardian of something too important to abandon for mere survival. The riders never came close enough to identify, disappearing into a canyon system that led away from their route. But the encounter left Red with a deeper appreciation for Claire's courage. She rode through country that would terrify seasoned frontiersmen with the calm of someone who had already made peace with death. As evening approached and they made their second camp, he watched her arrange her bedroll so the saddlebag rested against her heart, and finally understood that whatever she carried wasn't just precious. It was all that remained of her reason for living. The cemetery ridge appeared on the 4th day, like a broken promise against the sky, its weathered headstones scattered across the hilltop like teeth in an old man's mouth. Claire's horse stumbled on the rocky approach, and Red caught the animal's bridle, steadying both mount and rider as they climbed toward the abandoned fort that crowned the hill. The wind carried the scent of sage and something else, something that spoke of endings and beginnings, of earth that had swallowed too many dreams. Claire's fingers tightened on the saddlebag, and Red noticed how her knuckles had gone white, how her breathing had changed from the steady rhythm of travel to something shallow and desperate. The fort's broken walls rose before them like the ribs of some great beast, and beyond them, the cemetery stretched in uneven rows, each marker a testament to lives cut short by bullets, disease, or simply the brutal honesty of this unforgiving land. As they crested the ridge, Claire dismounted without waiting for Red's assistance, her boots hitting the ground with a finality that made him flinch. She walked among the graves with the careful steps of someone navigating sacred ground, reading names carved into stone and wood, searching for something that would make sense of the journey that had brought her here. Red followed at a distance, leading both horses, watching as she paused at certain markers, her lips moving in silent conversation with the dead. The afternoon sun cast long shadows between the headstones, and in that golden light, Claire looked like a ghost herself, pale and translucent, as if she might dissolve into the desert air at any moment. When she finally stopped at a grave near the cemetery's eastern edge, Red felt his chest tighten with an emotion he couldn't name, something that lived in the space between sorrow and reverence. The headstone was simple granite, weathered but still legible. Captain James Morrison, 1st Cavalry, beloved husband. Claire knelt beside it, setting the saddlebag gently on the ground, and for the first time since Red had known her, her composure cracked like ice in spring. Her shoulders shook with silent sobs, and she pressed her palms against the earth as if trying to push through to whatever lay beneath. Red wanted to turn away, to give her privacy in this moment of raw grief, but something held him frozen. Perhaps the recognition that he was witnessing something sacred, something that demanded witness. The wind picked up, stirring the dust around the grave, and Claire's hair whipped across her face like a veil. When she finally spoke, her voice was so quiet that Red had to strain to hear it over the desert's endless whisper. "I brought him home, James," she said, her words carried away by the wind almost before they left her lips. "I carried him across 3 territories, through Apache country and outlaw trails, because I promised." She opened the saddlebag with trembling fingers, revealing a simple tin box that caught the dying light like a prayer. Red's throat constricted as he realized what he was seeing. Not just ashes, but the physical remains of a love so deep it had survived death itself. Claire lifted the box with both hands, cradling it against her chest. And Red understood that he was watching a reunion, a completion of something that had been broken when bullets found their mark in some distant battlefield. The silence stretched between them like a held breath, broken only by the soft sound of Claire's weeping and the eternal sigh of wind through stone. She began to dig with her bare hands, clawing at the hard-packed earth beside the headstone with a desperation that made Red's heart ache. The soil was stubborn, baked hard by years of sun and wind, but Claire attacked it with the fury of someone who had carried this burden too long. Red dropped the horse's reins and knelt beside her, his calloused hands joining hers in the work, and together they carved a small hollow in the unforgiving ground. Neither spoke as they worked, but Red felt the weight of her grief settling into his bones. The way her love for this dead soldier had become a living thing that demanded completion. When the hole was deep enough, Claire placed the tin box inside with the tenderness of a mother tucking a child into bed, her fingers lingering on the metal surface, as if reluctant to let go. As she began to cover the box with handfuls of earth, Claire's voice broke the silence with words that would haunt Red for the rest of his days. "Just bury me next to him when my time comes." The simple request hit him like a physical blow, and suddenly Red understood the true weight of what he had witnessed. Not just a widow's grief, but a love so complete that death was merely an interruption, not an ending. Tears he hadn't shed since childhood burned his eyes as he helped her pack the earth over the small grave. And when she finally stood and brushed the dirt from her hands, Red saw that something fundamental had shifted in her face. As if she had finally set down a burden she had carried across half the continent. The sun was setting behind the broken walls of the fort when Claire spoke those final words, and Red felt something break inside his chest like a dam giving way to flood. He had buried men before. Good men, bad men, men who died with their boots on, and men who simply faded away like smoke. But he had never seen anything like the quiet devotion that had driven this woman across 1,000 miles of hostile territory. The tears came without warning, hot and shameful, streaming down his weathered cheeks as he knelt beside the small grave they had made together. Claire watched him cry with the same calm acceptance she had shown throughout their journey, as if his tears were simply another part of the ritual, another offering to the love that had brought them to this wind-swept hilltop. Red tried to speak, to offer some words of comfort or understanding, but his voice failed him, choked by an emotion too large for language. In the gathering darkness, Claire reached into her coat and withdrew a small leather journal, its pages yellowed with age and handling. She opened it carefully, revealing page after page of letters written in a careful, feminine hand, letters that had never been sent. Conversations with a dead man that had sustained her through the long months of grief. Red watched as she tore out a single page and folded it carefully, then placed it on top of the small mound of earth that covered the tin box. The paper fluttered in the evening breeze like a white moth, and Red realized he was witnessing the final act of a love story that had begun in life and would continue beyond death. The simplicity of the gesture, one last letter to a husband who would never read it, broke something in Red that he hadn't known was still whole. "He used to say that love wasn't about the time you had together," Claire said, her voice steady now, cleansed by the completion of her task. It was about what you were willing to carry when that time was over. She stood slowly, brushing the last of the dirt from her hands, and Red saw that the terrible tension that had driven her across the desert had finally left her body. In its place was something that looked almost like peace, as if she had finally set down a weight that had been crushing her for months. Red wiped his eyes with the back of his sleeve, embarrassed by his tears, but unable to stop them. And when Claire looked at him, he saw understanding in her gaze, not pity, but recognition of a shared humanity that transcended the careful distance they had maintained throughout their journey. The horses nickered softly in the growing darkness, and Red realized that their journey together was ending, that whatever had bound them together across the hostile miles was dissolving like mist in the desert air. Claire walked to her mount and began checking the saddle straps with the mechanical precision of someone preparing for another long ride. But Red could see that something essential had changed in her movements. The desperate urgency that had driven her was gone, replaced by the measured actions of someone who had completed a sacred duty. When she turned to face him, Red saw that she was already planning her departure, already calculating the miles between this hilltop and whatever life awaited her beyond the horizon. The thought of her riding away into the darkness filled him with an unexpected sense of loss, as if he was about to lose something precious that he had never quite understood. "Where will you go now?" Red asked, his voice rough with emotion and desert dust. Claire considered the question for a long moment, her eyes fixed on the small grave that held all that remained of her husband's earthly form. When she finally answered, her words carried the weight of someone who had looked into the heart of grief and found something unexpected there, not despair, but a kind of terrible freedom. "I don't know," she said simply. "For the first time in 2 years, I don't know where I'm supposed to be." The admission hung between them like a confession, and Red understood that he was witnessing the moment when a woman who had defined herself entirely by her devotion to a dead man began to imagine a future that belonged to the living. As they prepared to leave the cemetery, Red took one last look at the small mound of earth that marked the reunion of two hearts separated by war and death. The letter Claire had left fluttered in the night wind, and he wondered what words she had written to her husband in that final message, what secrets she had shared, what promises she had made, what love she had declared to a man who existed now only in memory and ash. The tears came again, unbidden and unstoppable, and Red finally understood why this simple act of devotion had broken him so completely. Because in a world where love was often selfish and temporary, he had witnessed something pure and eternal, something that made him believe that perhaps the human heart was capable of more than he had ever imagined. Red never spoke of what happened on that ridge, but something in his eyes changed forever. He stopped taking jobs that led him past cemeteries, and when other cowboys asked why, he would only say that some ground was too sacred for a man like him to disturb. The tin box had taught him that love wasn't just about the living, it was about the promises we keep to the dead, the vows that outlast breath itself. Claire disappeared into the desert the next morning like smoke, leaving only hoof prints and the memory of her quiet strength. Red searched the horizon for days, hoping to catch one last glimpse of the woman who had shown him what true devotion looked like. But she was gone, carried away by the same wind that had brought her to him, leaving him with nothing but the echo of her final words and the knowledge that he had witnessed something holy. The abandoned fort below the ridge began to feel different to the few travelers who passed through. They spoke of a presence there, something gentle and watchful, as if two souls had finally found their peace in that desolate place. Red knew it was true. He could feel it in the way the wind moved through the sage, in the way the sunset painted the headstones gold, in the way his own heart had learned to carry grief without breaking. Years later, when Red's hair had turned silver and his hands shook with age, he would return to that ridge every spring. He never brought flowers or words, just his presence and his memory of the day. He learned that some love stories don't end with death. They begin there. The two graves side by side had become his church, his reminder that in a world full of temporary things, some promises are eternal. On his final visit, Red placed his hat over his heart and whispered the only prayer he knew, that when his time came, someone would remember him with even half the devotion Claire had shown her soldier. Then he mounted his horse and rode toward the sunset, carrying with him the weight of sacred ground and the knowledge that he had been blessed to witness love in its purest, most enduring form.